Good morning to everyone on the West Coast like myself, and good afternoon to everyone on the East. My name is Justin Connie, and I'll be the moderator for this session titled Information Literacy in a Generative AI World, Questions, Ideas, and New Approaches. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items. We have a code of conduct, which I will post in the chat after I'm done with this introduction. We also have an email address. If you have any questions or concerns regarding conduct or your experience at the conference, that'll also be in the chat. Please make sure your microphone is muted. We will have the Q&A at the end, but we also welcome your questions in the chat and comments throughout this presentation. I'll be looking for questions and moderating that. The session will be recorded, so if you or your colleague aren't able to attend this or you'd like to share it, it will be posted on the YouTube channel afterwards. If you'd like captions enabled, you can click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Morris, who is a librarian and educational consultant with 12 years experience in academic libraries. She is currently the Assistant Director of Academic Engagement at the University of Georgia, and her research and teaching interests include media literacy, AI literacy, disinformation, and civics education. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
All right. Thank you so much, Justin. Really appreciate it. Thank you for moderating today. Thank you all for taking the time to join this session. I'm excited to dive into this topic. As we said, please keep comments coming in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that throughout, and I'll leave plenty of time at the end to take your questions. All right. So for today's agenda, we're going to start by looking at some trends in AI literacy and some different, I think, themes that seem to be emerging. Then we're going to turn to looking at information literacy frameworks and really start considering information literacy in light of the changes and trends and different things we're seeing around the emergence and progression of generative AI in our information landscapes. And we'll close out with some ideas about how information literacy itself might continue to evolve and respond to the sort of new generative AI world we're all inhabiting. So some guiding questions I had in mind as I was putting this presentation together. First, of course, is how AI is sort of shaping our information landscapes in general. And we're going to talk about this a lot more in sort of the back half of the presentation. We're also going to consider what information literacy might look like sort of in these new AI-mediated environments and how these environments are being increasingly shaped by technology like generative AI. And we'll close out by thinking about what are some of the skills and also mindsets, crucially, that I think can be needed for this sort of evolving information landscape in this space. All right, so there's a lot of AI literacy competencies emerging. It feels like every time you turn around and you want to sort of popping up somewhere. But I've been interested to see, I guess, some common trends sort of throughout these different competencies and frameworks and things that might be emerging. And I'm sure many of you are working on projects at your institution. So if you have something in the chat you'd like to share on that, please feel free. I pulled a couple here just as sort of a sample. These, of course, aren't the only ones out there. But there's Leo Lowe's work on AI literacy. UNESCO has a framework for both students and teachers. The Digital Education Council has come out with some competencies around AI literacy, and Stanford also has done some work on this too. And I wanted to sort of pull these together here because I think it's quite interesting to see the sort of common themes and framing that are sort of emerging in these concepts of AI literacy as we're all sort of grappling with what this looks like, what it means, especially what does it look like for different learners? How do we scaffold this and all of these questions? So a lot of these different frames obviously are putting an emphasis on things like technical knowledge, ethical awareness, and a focus on that is I'm happy to see a through line through many of these emerging frameworks, as well as things like critical thinking skills and different ways of sort of approaching AI from perhaps a more human-centered perspective, which I'm glad to see UNESCO and the Digital Education Council both call out. So in terms of overarching trends, these are just a couple that really sort of came to mind for me. If you have other things you've noticed, feel free to comment on that. But across these different frameworks that seem to be emerging, there's often a sort of call for equipping people to actually use AI tools effectively for different purposes. The question around appropriate use of these tools or whether or not to actually use these tools, I think is also something really well worth considering. Um, However, there seems to be a common through line, again, within these AI literacy frames, sort of talking about this kind of usage aspect um, in that sort of framework. There's also a kind of call closely related to actually using AI tools that connects to understanding how AI tools actually work and how they are developed. So this might get at things like having an understanding of something like machine learning or large language models and the sort of technical expertise that seems to be kind of coming into play. And of course, many questions about what that looks like for different groups or what does that entail. The last two here, of course, evaluating tools. And I think it's for me important to kind of flag a distinction between evaluating the output of a given generative AI tool, such as the response you might get from ChatGPT when you enter a response. But I think there's also space here for calling upon people to evaluate the sort of the tools in and of themselves. So are there situations where it might be more or less appropriate to use one over the other, or perhaps not appropriate to use an AI or a generative AI tool at all? And the last area is, of course, this idea of ethical use and design of different sorts of generative AI tools and kind of AI tools more broadly. So those are just some trends that I had noticed among these sort of emerging AI literacy frameworks that I thought were sort of interesting and potentially helpful to flag here. So, with that sort of setup around AI literacy, what we're actually going to be doing today is spending a lot more time on information literacy itself, because I think it can be really impactful to consider information literacy within this new emerging AI space. And if there's connections to be found, ways these things can shape and influence one another, etc. So I flagged two information literacy frameworks here that we're going to sort of compare and sort of situate within this sort of new AI world we're all experiencing. So of course, there's the ACRL framework for information literacy and higher education. These are the frames. I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with this, so I won't belabor this or read them all to you. And I also wanted to pull the AASL Standards Framework for K through 12 school libraries, which flag a number of different sort of competency and mindset areas around skills such as inquiry, collaboration, curating information in different ways, being able to explore different topics. So that was just another space that I think can be really helpful to consider, especially as we're thinking about both AI literacy and information literacy and how these things might be scaffolded in the future. So for me, putting K through 12 standards into conversation with standards sort of at a higher education environment, I think can be really interesting and hopefully productive to do. So it's worth noting that information literacy itself has its own sort of unique history and evolution. So there is certainly a historical context and evolution to information literacy. The initial emergence sort of came in the 1970s, and this is kind of a sidebar interest of mine, but I think it can be quite fascinating to critically analyze and really dig into the context surrounding the emergence of information literacy sort of as a concept, as sort of a frame or sort of a focal point for our profession. In the 70s, you can certainly consider the technical context with the sort of emergence of this computing economy, politics that were happening at the time, the social context, etc. So I think it can be really helpful to consider how information literacy emerged in that space, and then how it's also evolved in the face of other developments in our information landscape. So we've been through the rise of, the emergence of the internet, evolutions in social media, the emergence of Wikipedia onto the scene, or things that perhaps didn't pan out so well, like the somewhat infamous era of Second Life, if anyone remembers that. Please flag in the chat. It was a very odd time. But I think it can be useful to think about those contexts as we're now considering this current moment we're in and what might be really different and unprecedented in some ways, and what might be also perhaps continuing trends we've sort of been seeing for quite a while in terms of generative AI. So I think there can be some real value in sort of applying the sort of context and this critical analysis, both to information literacy, but also this new sort of AI moment we're all sort of forcibly having to inhabit. I'm not sure we had much choice in the matter. But I think we can reflect on what new skills and also mindsets really might be required as we're sort of navigating this current space and considering future information landscapes too. Not that I'm a great prognosticator, but I think equipping people with transferable skills or sort of foundational skills like we find in information literacy can hopefully help people be flexible, able to adapt, and able to just think critically as we continue to see changes regarding generative AI and sort of our information landscapes in general. So I just wanted to offer that as kind of a frame for how we'll sort of proceed with the rest of our content here. So I wanted to spend some time before we sort of get back to our respective information literacy frameworks and thinking about AI literacy frames to actually consider the overall information landscapes we're sort of inhabiting and changes and trends we're seeing in those spaces. So I think one thing we're seeing is that generative AI in particular is certainly introducing a lot of challenges, some of them new, to our sort of overarching information landscapes that we all inhabit. Is introducing changes around things like information seeking behavior, changes as to how people communicate, how people find and discover information, how they have to go about evaluating content. All these things are sort of being impacted by AI. But something that I think is also important to recognize, and for me, I'm really interested in exploring this further, is that generative AI, in some respects, is exacerbating changes and issues we've already been seeing in our kind of information ecosystem. Things that are coming out of, say, search engines and social media and just the internet and internet culture in general. So, I think sometimes artificial intelligence and Gen AI can be cast as this very disruptive force and this sort of new and unprecedented thing, which it is in a lot of respects. But I think it also is sort of in line and following certain problematic trends that we've actually been seeing for a while. So keeping that in mind as to how we might think about information literacy in these spaces, or how something like information literacy can sort of respond to these challenges and these moments, can, I think, be really helpful. So let me just run through a couple of trends that I think are worth noting in our landscape and sort of how Gen AI is sort of furthering challenges here. The first is this idea of kind of a hype machine. If anyone's familiar with the work of folks like Emily Bender, you can find a lot more on this. But I think there's a lot of narratives around generative AI and a lot of emotions around it. Some that are sort of hyping this up as just the greatest thing ever. It will usher in a sort of technological utopia somehow. And also doom narratives where robot overlords are going to take over, etc. This sort of polarization can, I think, make it a bit difficult to actually navigate this AI space or have sort of discussions about generative AI or sort of evaluate AI. So I think it's worth kind of thinking about the sort of, context and how people are talking about these things as we're sort of navigating these landscapes. Some other things that are at play here. One is sort of a feeling of completeness or a lack of context. So I think something that's really worth noting with generative AI tools in particular is that the output from these tools can sort of present this very neatly packaged content for you. It can sort of feel separate sometimes from other sources, or it just feels sort of complete in and of itself, but it can leave out context or nuance or alternative views. There's sort of this, I think, trend we're seeing within these tools where, say, the chat bot will keep sort of responding to you as you're typing things in to sort of keep people almost within the generative AI environment so that you don't leave. You just keep engaging with that environment. That can be partly due to it's needing our content to train off of. And it's also similar to me and the way that social media sites often operate with this sort of endless scroll, and it's almost incentivizing people to never leave the platform. It wants your eyes, it wants your attention, it wants your engagement constantly. Aside from this sort of feeling of something being very complete, perhaps divorced from context, there's also this element of black box technology. And this is sort of a feature of a lot of generative AI technology, partly because these companies are seeking profit and don't necessarily want to share what they're working on with others because they're competing against other companies. Again, to me, this is also in line with things we see from things like search engines online or companies like Google or different social media sites with sort of proprietary algorithms. What can happen here is that users of these technologies and platforms, I think, can get really disadvantaged because it's not always clear in the case of generative AI how the tool is working or what it was trained on or why you're getting the results you're getting. And then we see articles where the developers themselves don't always know how the AI technology is working. So you have this sort of, I think, experience at play that can sort of put someone at a disadvantage if they're really trying to critically engage with a platform or critically analyze it in some way. Some other trends, of course, hallucinations. I'm sure you've experienced these or heard a ton about them, but so-called hallucinations are when sort of a generative AI might produce some very bogus information, make up a citation, things of that nature. This is certainly a known issue and can introduce, I think, really serious challenges in terms of people doing information seeking, information creation, and other sorts of tasks. Somewhat related to this is also bias, and that generative AI tools can really reflect biases and stereotypes that can be present in the data used to train the tool, or be present in terms of, how the training algorithm was sort of set up. It can really reflect human gaps in knowledge, stereotypes, biases, as well as sort of mis and disinformation as well, where either these generative AI tools might hallucinate and spread something wrong, or have sort of taken in actual mis and disinformation sort of in the training and then are kind of reiterating that to people. And absolutely right, the speed of change makes it incredibly hard to evaluate these different tools. It can be quite stressful to know sort of even what to focus on. And given how disruptive this landscape is, I'm sure some of the tools we're talking about right now might not exist in a couple of years or might morph in very unexpected ways. So it can be really, I think, difficult to know where to sort of center your attention or ways to sort of focus in and evaluate. All right, a couple of other information landscape issues I just wanted to flag. Um, there's a rising trend in sort of more personalized results when it comes to generative AI tools. And again, I think this mirrors a lot of what we see with online ecosystems in general, search engines, your sort of online account influencing things, social media sites where the algorithm's trying to feed you content it thinks you want. So what we're seeing is that a lot of these tools now require people to have user accounts. We're seeing generative AI tools recalling conversation history with people and sort of feeding that content back into them. Related to this is, of course, the emergence of filter bubbles, which has been an issue online for a very long time. But there's now some new research, which I linked in the slide, as to how AI tools can end up aligning sort of with user preferences or or end up leading users into sort of filter bubble spaces where you're just sort of hearing what the tool thinks it wants you want or what you want to hear. There's also research in terms of issues like cognitive offloading. This is a phenomenon where the idea is that if somebody's really reliant on, say, an AI tool for different tasks, it could maybe degrade their skills in things like communication, for example. Again, something that has happened with tools online for quite a while. Finally, is this increased need potentially for sort of technical knowledge. These things can be so complex and it can be difficult to understand sort of what's going on with something like a generative AI tool, why you're seeing what you're seeing, how it actually works, without some degree of understanding of some of the technology and trends that are going into it. So we'll talk more about this in a second. But these were just some, again, trends that I've sort of noted in terms of challenges around generative AI and sort of our information landscapes in general. So I think, again, generative AI is really exacerbating a lot of trends we've already seen with invisible kind of processes shaping our experiences with information. And I'll just pause here briefly to say I have a link at the very last slide where you can download the slides, and I'll make sure everyone has access to that so you have all the links and everything. So thanks for asking about that. Anyway, so generative AI is exacerbating a lot of trends we've seen. And there's certainly, I think, this through line of these sort of black box technologies and these invisible processes really shaping our experiences with information. So researchers, information seekers can all be sort of left, I think, navigating these increasingly opaque information environments. And then sometimes they could appear more transparent than they actually are. Back to that idea of generative AI tools giving you what feels like this very complete and full and neatly packaged response that could be lacking in nuance or other views or things like that. So I think a question going forward is how can we equip our students, our users, with the knowledge and skills and mindsets they need to sort of make sense of these really complicated spaces? And how can we empower them to maybe shine more lights on these sort of opaque environments or ask questions about them or know to do so in the first place? So that leads us to information literacy in an AI world. So I think as we've been talking through these different impacts on, our overall information landscapes, how people communicate, how they find information, how they kind of make sense of the world around them, generative AI is certainly impacting a lot of these things, and it's also continuing trends we've been seeing in terms of our information landscapes. And information literacy has definitely had to evolve and adapt and respond to a number of changes over the years in technologies and our information environments and how we communicate, how we find information, how we conduct research, and all of these things. So I wanted to pull out a couple of sort of selected frames from both of the previous frameworks to really start asking questions about what this framework starts looking like when you bring it into a sort of more AI mediated environment. So the first would be authority is constructed and contextual. So what happens again when you have AI output that might be sort of divorced somewhat from broader context, or it's not always clear where that information was really coming from? Related is sort of, again, scholarship as a conversation. And pardon my mouse, I need to move my chat window briefly. So what happens when the conversation that you're having is confined to an AI tools environment? And what does that look like for research? What does the information creation process start looking like when AI might be interjected into different parts of the research process? So this is all to say that not that we need to, just go all in on AI literacy or toss out information literacy frameworks, but that I think the frames we already have can be set up really well to perhaps respond to this moment. And perhaps we can consider ways to evolve them, ways to expand them, or ways to just consider them in light of all these changes with AI. So related would be some of the areas from the AASL framework. So I flagged a couple here, but in terms of inquiry, again, how does that process start shifting when you're introducing generative AI tools into the mix? With curation, I was really curious as to how learners are making meaning for themselves in these increasingly sort of black box environments we have online, especially with generative AI tools. This framework also flags exploring, and so talks about growth mindset and the importance of reflection, which I'm going to come back to in a second because I think that's fantastic. But, how can people develop these things when generative AI platforms don't necessarily encourage things like reflection, and this is true for social media and the internet as a whole, frankly. And the last one here is, of course, engaging. So this talks about ethically creating and sharing information. And of course, what does that start looking like in a world that is mediated in a lot of respects by generative AI? So, we already sort of mentioned that generative AI is accelerating a lot of trends and issues we've been seeing online with social media, search engines, things like filter bubbles and personalized results and privacy concerns, stuff that we've been dealing with and navigating as a profession for quite a while. So, I wonder how we can sort of leverage information literacy to continue addressing these accelerating trends and how information literacy could maybe evolve or expand in light of these trends. So I wanted to sort of close out here before we get to Q&A with some of the kind of emerging skills and mindsets in light of all the trends we've been seeing, in light of, the stances AI literacy is taking, and in light of the kind of existing frames we have for information literacy. What skills and mindsets might be significant in this current space and in this current moment? And what could hopefully equip people to navigate a really uncertain future when it comes to things like generative AI. Things are happening so fast. There's a lot of new movement all the time. And so, how can we equip people with habits or frames of mind to really kind of navigate and be adaptable and flexible to that kind of changing environment? So, some of the areas here that I just wanted to flag, I think one is that we're going to keep seeing a potential change in skills and also areas of emphasis. So, one example I have here is, of course, lateral reading, which I'm sure many of us do, and many of us have sort of taught our students for quite a while. I was reviewing sort of the SIFT method and research on lateral reading, and it really struck me how this is actually kind of set up in a lot of respects to potentially be of use when it comes to evaluating sources in an AI mediated world because there's such an emphasis of getting sort of off a given platform and going sideways, as it were, opening up tabs, looking for things. I think that's going to be such a useful skill and sort of habit to encourage in people, especially with these generative AI tools, which almost discourage you from leaving the tool. You're sort of encouraged to just keep chatting with the chatbot and staying in place and having interaction after interaction. So even building that awareness or even equipping people with just a small thing to just get out of that tool, open up a tab and double check on what you just heard, I think can be really valuable. So again, drawing on things we've already been doing and perhaps framing it or placing an emphasis on it in this new kind of AI landscape. Another area that I think we'll see kind of emerging is potential changes in sort of grounding knowledge needed to be both information literate and also AI literate. So this might get at some degree of kind of technical understanding. And I certainly don't think you need to become a computer scientist to understand these things. And I think there's real value in having a lot of diversity and different disciplinary expertise coming into play here and really opening up these conversations. But I do think there's something to be said for having some degree, whatever we think that's going to look like, of some understanding of the technology at play here. And I use algorithms as a good example. Works like Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble. Having that kind of background of the technology can, I think, sometimes be really empowering to help you better understand sort of what's going on with the tool, to better critique it or evaluate it or look at it with sort of a critical lens. So I really think this will be an interesting area of kind of ongoing conversation as a profession and as we sort of sort out what's really important to know about technology like AI or how generative AI tools work and what's going to be most important for our users to use these tools and also importantly critically think about them and evaluate them. Some other kind of emerging, I think, skills and mindsets that could be worth focusing on and worth kind of considering in information literacy is also potential changes or different areas of emphasis when it comes to different theoretical frames or lenses we might be using. I think the ACRL framework in particular uses things like meta literacy and threshold concepts, which can be, I think, really impactful lenses to sort of use in this new space as we're equipping learners to kind of navigate these really complex information landscapes. I think there's also work in places like critical information literacy, or I saw there's a session happening right now on data feminism, which I plan to watch after this is done. But different sorts of frameworks or approaches to pedagogy or approaches to kind of considering information that could be important to bring in or perhaps highlight in different ways, or sort of just reinforce and lean back into, as might be the case with something like meta literacy or metacognition. I also think there's been such an increased focus on ethics, which is really good to see in a lot of emerging AI literacy frameworks. And perhaps this is a invitation or opportunity to really kind of boost this up again in our work we already do around information literacy and work we've already done around information ethics, to kind of use this moment to highlight this even more. And I think we're seeing really heightened concerns and calls for this focus because of how generative AI works in a lot of respects and the issues it poses around things like privacy and bias and a whole host of other issues, environmental concerns. The list goes on, and we can have a whole other session just about that. So I think that can also be a really interesting space to consider going forward in information literacy. The very last thing I just wanted to flag is really just overall habits of mind. So I think there can be, as we're seeing, increased need for metacognition, the importance of reflection, especially given the trends we're seeing in our overall information landscapes and the kind of challenges that generative AI is really sort of introducing, the lack of transparency that can be present, the need for, different kinds of evaluation skills in light of things like so-called AI hallucinations or bias and results and things like that. So I think this could also, again, be a moment to perhaps come back to and sort of recenter and re-emphasize skills and habits of mind like metacognition, meta-literacy, reflection in the work we're already doing as a way to potentially respond to this generative AI moment. All right, so let me wrap up here, and I'm very excited to hear your questions. So, just some closing thoughts from me. I think that going forward, I'm really interested to continue the conversation as a profession, to continue iterating and evolving on this. But looking at sort of the different technologies powering our information landscapes, generative AI included, I think that's going to be increasingly important and potentially an aspect of really what it means to be information literate going forward, as well as AI literate. So really kind of using that understanding perhaps empower learners to evaluate these things more effectively, to apply a critical lens to them, to ask really important questions about why we're seeing what we're seeing and how these things work and what are the risks and opportunities, etc. So I think this would be something that we'll continue looking at and thinking about what makes sense for different age groups, what makes sense for different disciplines, and, where everyone's sort of falling in that space. The other thing that I think is going to be incredibly important going forward will just be encouraging, like I said, habits of mind around things like reflection, meta literacy, metacognition, and just using critical thinking skills. In the sort of generative AI environment, we've seen how these tools can crystallize trends that we've already been seeing around more opaque information landscapes and environments. And if we're thinking about information literacy in these spaces, I feel like reflection, metacognition, and things related to that are things we're equipped to do as librarians and the instruction work we do, and something that perhaps can gain even more importance or prominence in terms of how we approach information literacy. So I'll just say this AI moment is challenging and stressful, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but it could also be a space for us to really potentially recenter humans in our information landscapes and help learners make better sense of our information landscapes and also their place within those environments going forward. So that was what I wanted to share with you. Thanks for hanging in there as I went through all of this, and I'm really excited to hear your questions now. This is the link to the slides, and I can type that into the chat as well. And that's my LinkedIn. I'm not on there a ton, but feel free to find me and my email if you want to get in touch. And yeah, excited to hear your question. Thank you.
Great, Sarah. So it looks like you have just over 10 minutes.
Okay.
While you're typing that in the chat, I'll just quickly summarize. If we can just give a huge round of applause digitally, again, for a very interesting presentation. We do have a question in the Q&A and then one in chat as well. I'll
Yes.
read them off just so for the recording. And then
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
lastly, if anyone wants to save the chat, there is a little feature box down there where you can save the comments that have been produced there so far. So going off sort of what you talked about, the conclusion, the
Yeah.
question is, you said that Gen A often discourages reflection, but one of the uses I've seen most encouraged in students is feedback. Do you have any data or predictions as to how this will affect the research process?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I've been curious to see that trend as well. I think there's certainly an element of these tools where I see people encouraged to almost use prompts where you get a generative AI tool to like actually ask you questions and help you sort of think through something. So I think there's certainly we're seeing use case scenarios for things like that, which could be I think quite interesting. And going forward, I imagine there'll perhaps be some space in assignments to sort of consider, how you can use this for brainstorming or reflection or brainstorming a topic idea or asking questions. I think where I am sort of interested in perhaps, encouraging people to sort of think critically about these tools and as we're thinking about information literacy is that the fact that these tools almost kind of keep you in the environment in a lot of respects. And given the issues we've seen with things like, hallucinations and bias and other issues with the information, being so sort of overly reliant, I'd say, kind of on these tools for like all your reflection needs or all your brainstorming needs, might not be the greatest option. So I guess for me, I'd say both educating people about the sort of pros and cons and possibilities and the ins and outs of how these things work and just make them aware to don't just rely on one sort of tool or platform. So I hope that answers your question okay. But thank you. That was a really good one and something I've been interested to see given the emphasis on sort of hyping how these tools work in certain respects, but then kind of hand in hand concerns with the sort of the same feature, perhaps going off the rails sometimes. So.
Great. So we have another question regarding ethics. I noticed
Yeah.
that conversations that touch on the ethical hazards associated with AI list a host of reasons this
Yeah.
tech is problematic, but the
Yeah.
conversation just moves on. Do you think there's a space for knowledgeable opting out?
That's a really, really excellent point. I really hope so, honestly. I think it's really worth I've seen some articles recently on things called the transparency in AI movement and sort of people kind of encouraging a bit more transparency and kind of openness when it comes to these technologies. So for me, I think, it's important to have spaces to kind of opt out or actually to be able to think critically about what you're using this for, what's sort of the benefit, what might be the drawback there. And that can be on a very individual basis in terms of, sometimes is it perhaps more productive to do something in a different way, or are there drawbacks to using AI for this thing? And this can also get into broader kind of ethics around things like copyright and academic integrity and what's going to be considered best practice or acceptable in different disciplines or for, say, different journal submissions and things like that. So I think it's important to carve out space to have those conversations with our learners and our users. And I'm certainly an advocate of encouraging space for people to opt out. I think there's a lot of pressure to sort of opt in, and these a lot of online spaces sort of automatically assume you're just being opted into this thing. I wish it were the other way around, but having those conversations with learners or hopefully encouraging them to feel empowered to say, like, I'm perhaps not going to engage with this tool for XYZ purpose. And same goes with faculty. I'll just add briefly, not that we should bury our head in the sand and not use these things at all. I think it's important to be aware of them and trends and engage. But I really appreciate your point about opting out and having space and room to do that. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
So we have one comment question in the chat, and then we have three more
Okay.
in the other
I'll
room.
try to
So
go
that
fast.
might round out our time. But I also wonder if it will cause less communication between peers as well.
Yeah. I've sort of I worry about that honestly, and I thank you for mentioning that. I'm sure we all saw Zuckerberg's rather infamous pronouncement that everyone will just have some AI friends in the future, which was both comical and horrifying to me. But yeah, I do wonder if, people sort of get used to almost conversing with these chatbots, as it were, and if that might sort of cut down on other kinds of interaction. So I guess in terms of if you're teaching classes or working with faculty or, you do this yourself, etc., to really perhaps maybe think of ways to encourage kind of in-class communication and peer-to-peer communication outside of sort of an AI tool. But yeah, that's certainly something I think that's worth paying attention to and perhaps raising people's awareness around that potential pitfall.
And then the next question is, do you have any thoughts about intrinsic motivation as it relates to students doing research in an AI saturated environment?
Yeah.
Quickly, the context: I'm a teaching librarian in a small liberal arts college. We use
Hey.
threshold concepts, metacognition, decoding of the disciplines a lot, Caulfield Sift. All your points around that feel so right on, but I'm wrestling with how to work with students to see the
Yeah.
bigger picture and learn contextually if they're not already in that non-transactional space.
Yeah, I love what you just said, like applause. I would love to chat with you more about this. We're kind of on the same page. Yeah, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, and hopefully we can keep the chatter going on Discord as well. But I think that it can be potentially helpful to almost center that in and of itself. So we talk a lot about, I think transferable skills at my previous institution and my current one, and sort of the value of learning these things. But something that always kind of bugged me was it could often get very centered on sort of preparing for the workplace. And I think this can happen sometimes in student success initiatives. And not that that's anything bad, obviously, that's good to prepare people for. But something I've been really interested is perhaps bringing in things around like civics literacy and civics education into this space, and sort of what does it mean to be a citizen in the world? What does it mean to, go through a college program? And what does it mean to be information literate? And sort of pose these questions almost to students. I agree there's a lot of issues around sort of intrinsic motivation, but I think that's something I'm really interested in exploring further, is kind of opening that up to them and really having conversations about that in and of itself. And I'll just say, I think some of the research on things like cognitive offloading could potentially be interesting to bring into those spaces, and just sort of, kind of raise some awareness or dialogue around some potential pitfalls of being sort of overly reliant on some of these tools. So thank you for that great question. I hope that was an okay answer for you.
So we got 3 minutes left. So what I propose is just reading the next two questions and we
Yeah.
can kind of answer them. They're both about student
Okay.
learning.
Okay,
So
great.
generative AI has potential to be an aid to students who particularly have special needs and or certain
Yeah.
handicaps, deaf, vision problems, for example. Some educators are actively discouraging the use of AI in the classroom. What
Mhm.
kinds of discussions should librarians be having with teachers and professors to help explain the benefits and positive impacts of using AI as a learning tool? And the second one is, I see more and more students seeking research support who are resistant to or at least uninterested in learning basic information and literacy skills and
Mm.
want librarians to simply spit out results for them like search engines. I'm curious if you have thoughts on how the day-to-day landscape of instruction and education is changing and how those working directly with students can deal with that.
Yeah, those are both wonderful questions. To the first one, I'd say I think it is really important for librarians to get a seat at the table, as it were, and be able to have conversations with our faculty colleagues, with the departments. For me, I'm really quite interested right now, and I think it could be helpful just to get a sense of sort of where faculty might be at, or what are their kind of concerns and experiences. I think you're exactly right. There can be certain real benefits for, learning aids and different things when it comes to AI tools, as well as sort of drawbacks. So I'd say, getting that sense of where faculty are at, sort of where they're coming from, and then being able to perhaps either whether it's you want to offer a training or carve out a space for conversation or run a focus group or however you want to approach that, to be able to talk through some of those pros and cons and figure out where there might be, opportunities, gaps in knowledge, things of that nature. So I think that's a great point. For the second question, in terms of, yeah, I think there's this sort of unfortunate expectation nowadays, given how much of the internet works, everything's so fast and on demand and all of these things. So it can be tricky, I think, to bring that up with students and get them to sort of think through some of the implications of that. Something I've found kind of a potentially interesting approach is the issues with sort of bias and hallucinations and such when it comes to Gen AI. I think can be really eye-opening for people. And I've certainly had encounters with students where they are actually really concerned about some of those things. So perhaps an entry point for framing the importance of information literacy skills or talking about concepts like research as a conversation or the importance of someone's independent voice in these spaces. So I think you're exactly right on with noting that trend. And I wonder if there's ways we could frame or introduce certain concepts that might be of concern to students regarding generative AI as a way to kind of launch into those sort of conversations or highlighting different aspects of information literacy that can be important. So thank you for asking that.
Okay, and on that note, it looks like we're rounding out to the at the top of the presentation. Again, thank you so much for everyone's attendance and Sarah for your interesting presentation on this really timely topic.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And I haven't had a chance to get in the Discord yet, but I'll certainly hop in there and it'd be great to continue the conversation. I really appreciate your questions and your time, everyone. So thank you. Yeah.
And bye, everyone.
Bye.